Thank you. And I'm very glad to stand here. And I'm very happy to speak. And starting my gender pronoun he, him, and POIs in the chat, please. And starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Today, more and more the people who are living in the developing countries are exploited. They have no tangible way to resist the harsh scheme that is coming from the MNCs. We can give you the opportunity and have the way to resist them and to restrict their light and to restrict their actions to exploit them. That's why we beg to propose. 4 things I'm going to do. First, set up what kind of the world we support. Secondly, what is status quo's harm. And thirdly, how we can restrict the company's behaviors. 4th, weighing. Firstly, set up 3 things to say. Firstly, what is the target of this motions that which is the company? So I do think that kind of the companies has the did some kind of the harm to the developing countries already. That is like the many countries who have exploited the people who are in the developing countries' labor, or something did in the natural resource extraction, these kind of things. Why this is likely is because the developing countries is likely to go into the company, which is more influencing to their lives, and that is why they will likely to support that kind of things. And the capacity is already supported by the premise of this motion, and don't have to talk about that. Secondly, I do think that who would buy these kind of things, these kind of the assets? I do think several developing countries who are related to the particular one, the MNCs, will the sharing their stocks. That is a likely scenario. Since I do think the one developing countries have, I do think, less capacity to just control their the multinational corporations in the status quo. I do think that based on the regions, the ties or some kind of the stakeholders ties that some developing countries will share their holders. This means 2 things. Firstly, you can increase the capacity more, compared to the cases which is resisting to the multinational companies with only one countries. And also secondly, I do think this will prevent the harm that is extremely catering to the one developing countries, because they will control the company's entire cases or these kind of things. Thirdly, I do think this is a premise of this law. We can have, the governments can have already the large stake of the assets. That means, to some extent, that developing countries, the entity of the developing countries have the power to control the company to some extent, reject some kind of project coming from that is exploitative for the developing countries or these kind of things. That power is already assumed by these motions. Firstly, what is the status quo's harm? I do think the many the MNCs have done, the exploitation of the laborers who are living in the developing countries, and the natural resource exploitations, and the pollution of the air, the pollution of the waters, and some people is dying, and also that their life is, the health conditions has suffered these kind of things. Why the developing countries cannot stop these kind of things? 3 reasons. Firstly, there's a internal power structure compared to the developing countries people and the for hiring them. Then that kind of structure will perpetuate the relationships. The multinational companies who are hiring them is a higher, and the people who are hired is a lower position in the first place. But secondly, there are other entities or other communities, maybe the labor unions or some governments have less capacity, from the point of view of the monetary sources compared to the MNCs, and they are less likely to resist that kind of schemes. And thirdly, there's a lobbying exists in that multinational company will make the government not to restrict their exploitation in the countries. Since there's only one tiny developing countries, they cannot resist that kind of schemes. Since comparatively with one country, there's a large power gap between the developing countries and the developing country and the multinational corporations. How we can solve these systems? I do think by taking this motion, I do think that what we support is the exploitative policy by the multinational corporation is rejected, and some kind of exploitative or discriminative people CEOs is resigned in outside the house. Why this is likely? By 4-layer analysis. In the first place, they can present onto the stakeholders, community stakeholders like the committee, and then at that point of time, since they have the 30% or 50% of the assets, since this motion assumes, they can on that kind of particular time, they can reject or they can fire some kind of CEOs who are responsible to the exploitative policy in the in the status quo. But secondly, we can, if the developing countries will will sell that kind of assets, completely their monetary sources will be decreased. But thirdly, this has more implication towards that. Since developing countries is now owning the large part of their assets, if that company, the entity of the country will sell their assets, the other stakeholders of that company will also sell their assets. Then what means is the saturation of the selling effect, and also the decrease their the assets, the value is. Then the company with so much fear about the lowering the prices of their own assets, and that is why it can be the large restriction and the deterrence of them to get into the exploitative actions. But fourthly, I do think other stakeholders who are in the developed country also follow that kind of ways by two reasons. Firstly, there's a narrative not to restrict, not to exploit the developing countries like ESG investment or these kind of cases. But secondly, more importantly, who will what is the incentive of that kind of stakeholders? They are not why they hold their large corporations the assets. It's because they want to they assume that the constant and the long term but little bit not speculative benefits coming from the MNCs. This is like the often cases why people have the large corporations assets. However, that is by depending on the developing countries case, if the developing countries will lose and sell all of their assets, there is a huge risk towards the courageous of the future benefits. That is why the developed countries investors also follow the flow coming from the developing countries. Then that is the system what we support, and that is the reason why this system will likely to work. Weighing here, I do think in the first place, some economical harm coming from the opposition side is already mitigated. Since I do think in many cases harms will happen in the developed countries, and comparatively to the developed countries, I do think from the perspective of number of the people or vulnerability, we have already won. But even there is that economical effect is about the developing countries two ways. Firstly, our harm, like the natural resource extraction or the exploitation, is irreversible to the harm. Once we lose the life, or once we lose the natural sources, we cannot reverse them. And for these reasons, we beg to propose.
Okay, thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech. Let's invite Leader of Opposition. Here.
はい、聞こえますでしょうか。
はい、聞こえます。
はい、ありがとうございます。Thank you, Chair. From a leader of the opposition, I'm going to do three things. Firstly, I'm going to holistically rebut what we heard from the previous speaker. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how this is likely to lead to risky investment, meaning that it is likely to cause financial losses for these companies, and why that is bad for the developing nations' balance sheets and all that kind of stuff. And lastly, I'm going to talk about why we think that this is actually counterproductive towards the problem that the opening government mentioned in this debate, which was about how you can now protect environmental exploitation or labor exploitation or that kind of stuff. Now, firstly, about rebuttals. So in terms of the problem, they told us that, we can actually, these companies are exploiting people and the environment. Firstly, I think the problem is very minuscule and it is getting better because of the existence of customer awareness. And it's really increasing day by day. I think people are more aware that better companies have a responsibility in protecting people over just raising profits. We think that ESG stock exchange policies and actions are increasing day by day, and I think that's really good. The second thing is that even if exploitation does happen to a certain extent, I think it means that the companies operating in these nations are actually raising profits, meaning that there's going to be a certain level of taxation towards the government. And that taxation can be used in order to compensate for some level of of the exploitation that is happening due to the activities of these corporations. Now they told us that, oh, but companies cannot be regulated by these countries. Why is it? I think internal politics is always controllable by the people on the ground. If they can't regulate it, it probably means that people are wanting that a certain level of environmental problem in order to make sure that they have jobs and they have taxation. We think there is absolutely no problem with that. But lastly, we think that I think the better way of actually raising taxation, it would be to take on things like buying financial products, which are not necessarily reliant on one company, buying from a financial institution products which involves multiple companies' stocks packed together, and then you get to have a certain ownership over it. We think this way it decreases risk as well as having certain level of control over the activities of these companies, and it's actually better. Now, another thing to mention in the first one, in the beginning of my speech, is about what kind of companies are actually likely to be bought out by these nations. I think it is likely to be manufacturing. Why is it? It's because when you actually have a government investing a huge amount of money, presumably a very much amount of money, so much as a portion of so it's likely to be large, because they themselves told us that this is likely to be coming in the form of multiple nations coming together and buying a stock, meaning that it is very expensive, and in order to have a stock that is enough stock to influence the company, you need to be buying a lot, meaning that you can probably invest in one or two companies. But secondly, we think that it is likely to come in the form of manufacturing. Why is it? It's because during the discussion, I think there are going to be many populist politicians within these nations who advocate that we must control these companies because they are the ones who are enemy to us, meaning that it is likely to be the companies which employ a lot of people within the nations, because they are the ones who are the victims. Like the more victims labor is involved, meaning that politicians have a more influence over it, meaning that it's likely to be manufacturing, like car industry or textile industry and these kind of stuff. That is the setup. Now, firstly, why is it likely to lead to financial losses? Firstly, we think that it is very risky to rely on one or two companies and invest billions of dollars into that industry, because we think that market dynamics always changes. There is the existence of AIs, and just because these are big companies doesn't mean they're stable. Like Facebook lost a lot of money due to failing of their metaverse and that kind of stuff. But secondly, especially when you recognize that it is likely to be manufacturing companies, it means that it is very risky again, because manufacturing is day by day increasingly being replaced by AIs and robots, meaning that, and as a fact, like over the last decade, also like majorly many big companies are actually losing its stock value, especially in the field of manufacturing. So the likely scenario is that your stock, when you invest in billions into a company, that billion is likely to decrease day by day, and it's going to lose its value, meaning that you're generating losses and you're not generating profits. Your asset is decreasing day by day. That's what's going to happen within these nations. Secondly, we think that it's going to result in massive inefficiency. Notice that when you have a large amount of stock, it means that you are actually having control over investment, control over how you enact corporate policies, or you can actually even fire and appoint CEOs and that kind of stuff. Meaning that these companies have to negotiate with the bureaucracy that owns that nation. Bureaucracies are always very inefficient. They have to go through processes of a lot of documentation and that kind of stuff. And they especially have an evaluation system of not moving against threats that happen externally. Why is it? It's because when you change something and you fail, you lose your reputation, you cause problems, and you are likely to be evaluated less, meaning that there's going to be not efficient responding to the market dynamics that happens externally. Why is this a problem? We think, first of all, it damages the balance sheet of these developing nations, meaning that companies are going to be rated as having more risk of default. So no more FDIs are going to come. The FDIs are going to decrease. So which means that there's going to be less jobs and shit. But secondly, we think that simply it's going to harm a lot of people because economically. But lastly, why do we think this is actually counterproductive in protecting exploitation and whatever, environmental exploitation or whatever? So firstly, I think that when you become reliant on a company and you have already invested billions into it, we think that you have to listen to what these companies want to do in order to generate profit. So if you buy an automotive company and say that they have to exploit the environment in order to keep on maintaining the stock value, we think you have a political will to listen to it, because if you don't do that, you're losing billions and billions and billions. But secondly, especially when you have several developing countries buying one stock together, what that means is that you have a competition over the 3 or 4 nations that are buying it. Presumably, like if you're Vietnam, you have to compete against Laos or Cambodia to attract investments and to generate like a good livelihood for its people, meaning that you have to make your country more attractive for these companies to invest in. What that means is that they are going to listen to these companies and actually decrease environmental standards, which goes completely against what the opening government wanted to tell us, because which was to protect labor and environment. So for all these reasons, we think this is simply a waste of money. It's going to generate losses, and it is going to cause a lot of harm, and that's why we oppose. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that speech. Let's invite DPM.
Yeah, I'm audible.
Yep.
Three, two, one. First thing I want to clarify is the actual context of this debate, because they were just talking about like this country are likely to be manufacturing companies. I don't think so. It might be like logic, like it might be the majority of the cases, but I don't think this is majority of cases. There are a bunch of other examples. For example, like supermarkets or this really huge supermarkets, or for example, Amazon having so many factories or so many like and elsewhere. Or for example, like Uniqlo or like other those kind of Apple brand have so many factories in like developing countries. I don't think that only like manufacturing companies which whose their own stock are like gradually going down is not the only like context of this round in the first place. In this sense, the majority of cases, the majority of the analysis based on this assumption will not be not really like relevant. Then they were talking about, but secondly, they were talking about like you have like developing countries need to like hear everything what corporation says for the sake of like profit coming from stock price. I don't think so as well. Why? This is simply because this debate is just about like large multinational corporations which have so many like revenues out of this specific developing countries, and they have crazy amount of like money resources. In those circumstances, even if you don't have to really listen to everything coming from corporations, anyways, corporations' stock price don't really suddenly falls down. Rather, they have those things will rather goes up. I don't think like this is likely context. If you want to hear the structural reasons, then I will give you. So first material, why this would increase the revenue of the developing countries, and why this would lead to healthy, sustainable development of developing countries. So first assertion I want to talk about is based first reason why like developing countries revenue will like basically like keep increasing is because like developing countries will basically keep holding that kind of specific stocks, and this is likely to grow continuously and in a sustainable way. The first reason for this is because this corporation have the huge benefit in the first place, and they have constructed a dominant market which lessen the margin for like competition with other companies, or they have huge market to make profit in the first place, and they have the diverse and thus less risky money sources and so on. And so many investors and so many people like expect those companies not to really suddenly fall down for those reasons. And plus, given that that kind of stock is likely to be held by so many investors, which simply means that the stock price is likely to be resilient in so many like contexts. I.e., what I want to say is this is the price of the stock price is sustainable to the extent it won't suddenly falls down unless the collection of developing countries will take big action, as like Yuichiro said. Then, but second reason why I think like developing countries don't take a risky action, but rather they will like keep like making the profit is because the countries are also obviously, you know, like that should be, and they will like hire the best consultant of investors, and they will take a less risky action. They will have they really examine the stock market every day, every single day, and they will like really examine like the placement coming from the corporations. And I don't think this is like likely to be done in a really bad manner. Then second assertion I want to talk about is why the more healthy investment in return for acquiring stocks is likely to happen on the house. Because it's likely the company likely to invest more into the developing countries by increasing employment. What company is going to do is a company likely to invest more into the developing countries by increasing more like employment, or having more business, or having more factories and so on. And for the reason that the company expects stakeholders to keep investing, i.e. the developing countries, and company expect the wealthier countries have more capacity to invest at the end of the day, right? But secondly, the company expect more revenue of the government, which leads to more increase of the infrastructure, which will lead to more like smoother like benefit, smoother like business within the developing nation and so on. And i.e. those things will at the end of the day, this will lead to the better like business for the like developing nation by themselves. Plus, the reason why this will be done in a healthy way is because, and the reason why the corporation needs to be healthy is because if the image of that specific corporation goes down in developing countries, citizens will mostly require government not to invest in that particular company, right? And this is important because they say like, oh, populists would like manipulate the discourse and so on. Yeah, that's right. And thus, like the populists will say that like, will like now have like actual like capacity to really like hostile the companies, right? And the important point, the difference between the government and opposition is that we have a more sustainable way. In the opposition side, anyways, like the big corporation and exists in this house, but this will exist in the way in which company can do business by their own money only. But comparative here is that company can utilize money from government, which is less likely for them to use, and now have more room to invest in that kind of specific countries, and this will induce more optimistic spending coming from the multinational corporations. This will lead to the winning here is that this will lead to far greater and quicker growth in developing countries. And this is important because they said like even if like people might welcome the exploitation, but we say we can like welcome more exploitation on our house. But secondly, as I have explained to you, that we have more economic growth with less exploitative like structure of the multinational corporations on our house. Insofar as that this problem exists in this house, I think our side is far better insofar for the reason that we have like a realistic way to really like dismantle the power structure of like corporations, right? And by having like actual like actual soul to really cut off the corporations then anyways the incomparative here is horrible in opposition side because the likely scenario of like negotiating with corporations is likely to be done in a really closed way, and so many people have no access to what is actually going on in negotiation. And the problem here is that in so many developing countries, there's less low level of like loads to really like to really prevent, for example, bribery and so on, right? And it's more likely that this will done in dark way. But on the contrary, the negotiation will be done in like corporations, and I forgot like then this is so far accountable for the reason that those like what's going on in that within companies negotiation will be all will be published to the public for and to the investors, and all the things will be visualized on the house. This is far better because it's more accountable, and it's more likely to be like give more power to the company to really negotiate in a clean way. And plus this will like, and the collection of like developing countries will like have like actual realistic like power to go against that MNC.
Okay. Thank you for that speech. Let's invite the yellow.
ではすいません。聞こえますか？
はい、聞こえてます。
ありがとうございます。はい。頑張ります。Okay, thank you, everybody. First of all, let me deny the very important premise of government side. That is to say, without these motions, we cannot stop exploitative action of a multinational corporation. They tried to mention that this is a very unique way, but I think there are many multiple ways to prevent those kind of exploitation from happening, especially when Prime Minister already conceded that like the investor have incentive to cater to the ESG narrative or something like that. I have 3 reasons why alternative way to stop exploitation of those multinational corporations exist. First of all, as PM considered, attention to ESG does exist. Empirically, like olive finances or like greenwashing is done because the investor care about it, or like responsible resourcing, sourcing exists. Like they have to cater to the like demand from the farm or those kind of like outsourcing such kind of things. Those things actually happening in the society. This means that there are incentive for the investor to try to focus on how they are less exploitative, how they are caring about the green technology or such kind of thing. That's the premise of this debate. Secondly, we say that global check and balance system are likely to happen in a society currently. I have 2 reasons. Firstly, because individual worker can have a strong capacity to report or whistleblow bad action of individual corporations. Now they have SNS, now they have like picture, now they have the record. In this kind of situation, they can have comparatively better power to send this kind of information to the society. In this kind of situation, because multinational corporations have to cater to the demand from global populations, that will be critical damage to those kind of individuals. Secondly, also, even if individual media does not work, still conventional media, a big media, will focus on such kind of bad action of corporations because now ESG investment is very clear and people have attention to the less exploitativeness of corporations. Therefore, if they broadcast the very bad action of the corporation that will make profit, they can get take review. In that kind of situation, they have incentive to get such kind of, for example, like pick up one good like record or like a picture from the very bad factory or a polluting area of that kind of area to broadcast it in the nation and globally wide like something like that. In that kind of situation, global check and balance system will work. The third reason is cancel culture is prevailing in a society. Currently, as we know, the cancel culture that if people, corporations are doing bad things, people will boycott buying such kind of items or cancel such kind of things. These things exist. In that kind of situation, just like happened in the thrift shop accident in the Nike, people stopped buying those kind of things, and Uniqlo like exploiting those very people in the China, those kind of things, people stopped buying. By pressurizing those individuals, by the power of check and balance system, by the media, we can change incentive of those individual corporations. In this sense, even if some lobbying power is less, even if some financial capacity is limited, still it is possible on our side to fix the problem of a multinational corporation to do bad things like polluting or something like that. In that kind of situation, their argument is not unique way to protect those kind of individuals. Secondly, let me talk about how this acquiring large stake by developing country hamper efficient profit seeking of those kind of national global corporations, which leading to counterproductive of the like country. First of all, we have to recognize that developing countries are likely to irrationally like pressurize those multinational corporations' way of business. The opposition premise is that, oh, that corporations can make profit and they can get many tax revenue or they can get many haito from those kind of stock. Therefore, that is very beneficial. But we think because of intervention by that like developing country, that will be not done. 2 reasons. Firstly, because politicians have incentive to pursue short-term tangible benefit. Because in order for the politician to win the elections, you have to need vote from the citizens. Then, like you use a lot of money investing those kind of buying stake from those kind of the shareholder. In that kind of situations, they try to be accountable in the political discourse. In this sense, they will try to say that, oh, I can make that CEO who was exploitative resign, or I can stop this pollution, which leading to the protection of vulnerable individual. This kind of presentation will be very plausible and very easy to understand even people not so like smart like me. In that kind of situation, that politician's narrative to try to manipulate individual exists. Therefore, even if in long term, that stopping this polluting in some area or like increasing the like labor wage, those kind of the factory is not so beneficial for the multinational corporations. The developing country have incentive to carry out this kind of pressurization. This will ruin the important capacity of corporation to do that. The second reason is like society are going to pressurize politicians to do that because they think that our tax is very used for the stock of the kind of corporations. Therefore, that should be used in an efficient way. There is demand from citizens in that kind of situation that will be very strong to the extent politicians necessarily have to show the result of their own investing money into the multinational corporation. In this sense, those individuals will do that. But that developing country necessarily cannot have a capacity to actually get those kind of like fixing problem of those kind of things because they are just a professional of developing country of domestic. They don't know about the outside situation which operating in the other country or something like that. In that kind of situation, they cannot achieve those kind of the efficient working system. Okay,
when developing countries' government try M&A, they will usually work with local conglomerates. So they don't bureaucrats. They don't just use bureaucrats to expedite the process. So your characterization is very unrealistic.
I don't know detail about that contextualizations, but if the government, once they have stock, there will be pressure to the politician. The internally politician also think I have to suggest a very good result. In that kind of situation, that process is likely to hamper good, efficient running business of those kind of individual corporations. Therefore, their argument does not make sense. Then this is very problematic because that, like, first of all, that corporation cannot make efficient way to make money, right? Therefore, like they will lose their attractiveness. Therefore, investor used to exist that will escape from those kind of like they will just sell the stock, something like that. Secondly, they have said they will make the CEO or those people resign. This means that like a trustful leader will be forcibly resigned. This means that there's no future like a concrete benefit of supporting those kind of buying stock of those kind of corporations. Therefore, such efficient money business of such kind of multinational corporation cannot be done. Moreover, like the Western financial institutions are going to sell the stock. Their incentive is to sell stocks in the manufacturer sector because they want to shift to service sector. Therefore, like benevolent shareholder cannot have check and balance system in this specific field. Therefore, that cannot make the good profit of corporation. This leading to counterproductive, as my partner already told you. So we win this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, GLO, for that speech. That concludes the opening half. Now let's invite member of government.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. POIs, you can turn on your video, unmute yourself, use the chat, whatever is fine. The status quo is a world where a lot of middle-income countries have hit the roof of development and cannot develop any further. The status quo is also a world where many low-income countries are locked up in that position and cannot move out of that situation. What this is about is that it is an industrial policy that pushes the industrialization of these countries way further in the way that in which it allows these countries to develop further into the future. That is what we propose. Firstly, how will this policy actually look like, realistically speaking? We would argue that this is an extension of pre-existing industrial policy as opposed to investment programs suggested by this opposition team. And this will be done in strategic ways. What does this look like in specific? 3 key points. Firstly, this is likely to be a targeted and concentrated investment on particular industries that are related to pre-existing national industries of those countries. So for example, if you're Chile, you would go for wine industry or aquaculture industry. If you are Brazil or Mexico, you would probably go for the oil industry. If you are Bolivia or countries in Southern Africa, you'd probably go for battery companies insofar as you are rich in lithium reserves in the status quo. Secondly, this process is likely to be mediated by financial giants, for example, Citibank, for example, Morgan Stanley. They always do this sort of stuff, and financed in assistance by local conglomerates, giants of countries like, Indonesia, the Salim Group, or in India, the Tata Group. They are likely to be heavily involved in this situation as well. Therefore, it's not really a huge risk to invest insofar as you're being subsidized by local industries that have an interest and stake in these industries to begin with, responding to Ower's suggestion. Third of all, you're likely to invest to be able to reach the 51% bar in terms of the amount of stock that you have in that company. Importantly, this includes a due process where you're likely to have conditions such as, firstly, retaining board members of the company that you're purchasing in this process, insofar as you want to retain things like technology and expertise, but also you're likely to be able to maintain employment as a precondition to investing in these corporations because you want the technology and expertise of existing employees. Why is this then the likely comparative that we stand behind in this debate? Firstly, obviously countries know that they cannot acquire stakes in all multinational corporations, and you have to make a choice. And obviously the likely choice is one that is heavily connected to the current existing industry in the nation, insofar as that is where you're most likely to see the return of profit. But secondly, empirically, this has happened in the past, and there are realistic reasons for why politicians would have an incentive to do so. Firstly, these politicians obviously want the development in the way that people on the ground can feel the impact of that development. They cannot feel the impact of rising prices and, money going into the pockets of politicians. They also want to feel like things like employment given to the people on the ground. That's why politicians have this incentive. But secondly, obviously these politicians are connected with local groups, national companies, or domestic giants. That's why they have an influence in this process as well. And that is the reason why this is the likely comparative in this debate. Responses. Firstly, they said, it's risky to rely on few companies. This may be true if you're putting value on capital gain, i.e. if you're planning to sell your stocks and then gain, profit from that process. But our claim is that we don't find any value in that because the kind of technology that these companies have will not change even if stock prices go down. That does not affect our case. Secondly, they said there's a risk of bankruptcy because balance sheet might be, kind of bad. But obviously, the fact that you have due diligence in the process of purchasing these companies means that you won't purchase companies that have a huge risk in the first place. I don't think Goldman Sachs would, risk their reputation by failing to do this process. So I don't understand why that's comparative. So in terms of arguments, firstly, I want to talk about industrial development and how this leads to advanced industrialization. Two things. Firstly, you're likely to be able to access a high-level technology. In the status quo, what happens is that these countries do not have the necessary technology. For example, in terms of oil extraction, Mexican domestic companies, Brazilian domestic companies do not have the resources or technology to go deeper in to access the oil that's not yet being discovered in the status quo. For example, textile giants, countries that rely on textile, for example, Madagascar, know how to produce these things, but they don't know how to market these things to the global stage, thereby losing a lot of profit margins in this case. Our paradigm is a world where you firstly incorporate all of these technologies together insofar as you have the resources that multinational corporations have, but also secondly, you're able to process more advanced products in the future, insofar as you access the necessary technologies to be able to, craft cars or electric cars in the future in the case of lithium industry. That's our comparative. Secondly, the status quo is a world where you have many dispersed industrial networks in cases where, for example, like lithium is, extracted in Bolivia, and then there's other parts constructed in Southeast Asia. You bring all of that together to China, and then China gets all the profit. That's the problem in the status quo. And in this case, you don't have the ability to move up the ladder one step at a time as a country that's in in the condition like Bolivia. On the other side of the house, you have the capacity to horizontally expand in multiple countries, multiple industries, and benefit from it because you're able to control the whole spectrum of this industrial network. This means that you're able to, as Bolivia, for example, craft batteries unilaterally, and you're able to profit off of that in this case. Secondly, I want to talk about expansion to countries that are currently underinvested in the status quo. There are two problems on the their side of the house. Firstly, there's the problem of the race to the bottom. Let me explain this, but before I move on, POI, yes.
Opening.
I'll move on. Okay.
All right.
So, the status quo is a world where countries have to fight against other countries insofar as they want the contract with one multinational corporation. Oftentimes, this is true because many developing countries have shared comparative advantages. So, they tend to offer lower and lower standards. For example, low payment to employees, no technological transfers, environmental destruction, all of that stuff. On the other side of the house, that changes. Firstly, because it becomes a collective effort. For example, like probably Brazil and Mexico would cooperate to purchase one oil giant. Probably like Bolivia and Southern African countries would cooperate to purchase one battery giant. That means these countries now have a collective incentive to benefit all of the country insofar as that's the best way to profit off of this company. Secondly, this means that you have expansion to include the most vulnerable countries that are currently underinvested. For example, Mali and Niger currently struggle because they're landlocked and they cannot beat Nigeria in terms of conditions. But if Nigeria, and together with these countries, control one industry or one corporation, then obviously Nigeria has an incentive to expand to Nigeria and Mali insofar as expanding means lowering cost of production, and that benefits all of the countries. But lastly, I want to talk about investment. Currently, you lack it because investors see no realistic opportunity of profit margins from infrastructure projects done by states. On the other side of the house, investors know that there are ample resources in developing countries, so they see an expected future of development. That means they're far more likely to see calculatable profit on the other side of the house and thereby assist in investing in these industries. For those reasons, we propose.
Member of government for that speech. Let's invite member of opposition.
Can I check I'm audible and visible?
Yeah, you're audible and visible.
Great, thank you. POI's chat, please. Alrighty. 3, 2, 1. Before extending, I want to do 3 extraneous rebuttals. First, on OG case about fixing exploitation and whatnot, I don't think this is very true. I don't think the O engagement is adequate. I don't think the likelihood is there. So what we're going to do is just prove to you that it's largely symmetric, that developing countries don't have incentives to protect other developing countries. I'm likely selfish, and therefore I don't care if exploitation happens in other nations. Therefore, I'm still likely to let exploitation of other nations go, and I don't think exploitation significantly goes down. About CG then, the first point that really confused me was CG saying that, well, I'm likely to invest in a field that my nation already works a lot in. I don't think this is always true, especially because I have massive incentive to diversify. Like if my nation is oil-centric, then maybe I'll invest in natural gases because the oil prices might die tomorrow. I don't think that it's always true that I invest in my own field. But far more importantly, the third engagement in my speech, and probably one of the most important things I want to say here, is that Tota's entire thing on like technology sharing doesn't really matter much, right? Like I could just buy the technology still, and everything always has a cost. I could likely buy it without having to invest significant amounts of my nation's economy into another corporation. I think, for example, like microchip technology was bought by China from America. You can buy these kind of technologies even if it comes at a price and even if it's not on the open market. But with that said then, my speech is going to be very, very simple because I'm, frankly speaking, not as smart as everybody else in this debate. I don't have enough matter to debate this. So my speech, my extension is very simple, that even in a world in which these corporations succeed and the developing country succeeds with it, that the development of the country is fundamentally harmed by the nature that you're reliant upon another corporation. The premise of this argumentation is to say that opting out of a corporation and opting out of the investment that you made to that corporation is inherently very hard or going to cost your economy a lot of money. And the simple reason why is something that other speeches have already told you, right? The value of your stock crashes at the moment in which you start selling it. It's very simple supply and demand. So you realistically are unlikely to be able to leave this partnership for a significant amount of time or just forever. here's the mechanization as to why development is harmed in this scenario. There's 3 reasons as to why you have to be able to opt out for you to be successful. First is the reliance, right? This is generally what OO gives you, but with the note that imminent possibility of failure de-incentivizes a lot of risk taking that is important for development. You have to be able to take risks to develop, and this is impossible when the amount of money that you get and like the profit margin that you have is reliant upon something that you don't have full control over. Remember that it's not necessarily true that you're going to have majoritarian control over these corporations. You likely have other stakeholders, you likely have competing stakeholders, you likely have other board members who have capacity to control some part of the corporation. I think it's a massive assumption upon the other benches to assume the significance of control that you likely have over this corporation. You probably don't have enough control to independently, dictatorially decide everything that happens to the corporation. Again, this implicates the reliance, that you're reliant upon other people to make decisions for your own nation. This makes you very risk averse, and you can't take necessary risks. And you can't take the necessary risks that is important for a country's development. The comparative is very, very simple. If you aren't reliant upon one other corporation with one other main controller, that you are much more likely to be able to take risks, that you are significantly more diversified. The second reason why you have to be able to opt out to be successful is because you're essentially forced to put all your eggs into one basket uniquely on proposition, that when your only method for profit is one corporation, that you have no choice but to invest more into that corporation. This is why many oil tycoons, for example, fail at diversifying into other fields, even though they do try, because it is fundamentally necessary for development. You likely have to err on the side of caution, you likely cannot diversify, and you likely have to stay in partnership there. The third reason why opt-in is necessary or opt-out capacity is important is because bottom-ranking ground-level workers are fucked. This is the most important mechanism in my debate. That is to say that uniquely when you have a partnership with a corporation, the lowest-level workers are harmed, and there's 3 reasons as to why this is true, all of which discussing incentive and capacity. First, on the incentive, right, keeping pay low and working hours high there's a massive incentive for you to do so to maintain profitability for the corporation or to increase the profit margin of that corporation. And therefore improving the quality of life of individuals on the ground is very, very bad. The implication is that the rich individuals who control the corporation, the people who control the country and therefore much of the corporation, have very low incentive to push those funds into lower level workers and develop as a nation as a whole. As long as I'm getting rich, I don't care if everybody else isn't. Second, me as a rich person also individually likely doesn't want this, excluding the collective corporation. That is to say that it's very simple human psychology, right? Resources, opportunities, all of that is zero sum. If other people are getting richer, I'm getting less rich comparatively, and therefore I have massive incentive to thwart the capacity for other individuals to get as rich as me. Thirdly, even on a capacity standpoint, trickle is highly unlikely because corporations just simply aren't structured that way, right? It's the country that is getting the profit, not necessarily the people. I think the comparative here is the most important thing. Here's why we're better in this regard. Because internal investment directly means improving internal industries. Note that the only other alternative, and the alternative that O also pushes, is likely the development of internal agricultural or industries, which means that I have to help the ground level workers. I have to improve the quality of life for these people. I have to expand the corporation and the capacities of the grassroots corporations for my country to develop. I'm forced into that if I don't invest into multinational corporations. The implication is that obviously ground level workers get far more economic benefit, their quality of life improves, and their lives are better. So the impact of this entire bit of extension and argumentation is to say that even if the corporation that you're partnered with succeeds and that your economy succeeds with it, that it's likely only the rich people's economy, that it does not necessarily connote an improvement of quality of life at the lower level. It does not necessarily mean that these people's lives are getting better. And on the comparative, we are forcing developing countries to invest into the people on the ground. We also tell you that reliance and not allowing you to diversify also has massive economic harm, which doesn't allow for the full development of your country. So even in the best case scenario in which these corporations do succeed, even assuming that the country succeeds with it, that your development is fundamentally harmed, that this likely means that you cannot fully develop. So for all those reasons, very, very proud to stand on closing opposition. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Member of Opposition, for that speech. Let's invite Government Whip.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairperson. I would like to answer 3 questions this debate. First of all, what is the counterfactual that the opposition side is supposed to defend in this debate? Secondly, is the small risk worth taking for the bigger utility? Thirdly, what is the unique about acquisition compared to other alternatives? First of all, what is the realistic counterfactual? The closing opposition's main extension is that over-reliance is problematic, and as a result of that, the lowest level of workers will be even more exploited. But those problem is happening right now in the status quo. The over-reliance is the situation that we have observed historically so far in the status quo. For example, Venezuela, the government, the country as a whole, is already super dependent upon one oil company and one oil industry. That's why we'd like to mitigate on our side of the house by taking the large share of those pre-existing corporations. We can better access better utility and economic outcome and expertise that these corporations have. Therefore, we can rather reduce the reliance by having a collective power against those one company. Secondly, the Tota explained that collective bargaining power across the region, across the one region, for example, collaboration between Brazil and Venezuela and Chile, and those third world countries will unionize themselves and fight against large giant tech or giant conglomerate. And that process is also necessary for us to reduce the level and degree of reliance that we have already observed in the status quo. Therefore, the consequence will be opposite. We can rather mitigate the level of dependency or power and structural power imbalance or disparity between the state and pre-existing large company. And that's the good thing about acquiring the shares. Second question in this debate is the small risk worth taking? This is a direct engagement to opposition. The main case from open opposition is that the financial risk, this acquisition will result in a huge damage in financial risk, and that therefore it damages the balance sheet of the state. Here comes our extension. Our extensions are superior to opening opposition's case for 2 reasons. Firstly, we have explained the realistic context in which this M&A and acquisition happens. And secondly, we fundamentally destroy the underlying simple logic and premise of opposition's case, which is overdependence. How did we exemplify that in our extension? Firstly, when this margin acquisition happens, usually the government works with the local conglomerates. In the case of Indonesia, the Salim Group is the biggest conglomerate, biggest local group. Therefore, usually these conglomerates are involved in the process of large-scale margin acquisition led by Indonesian company. And this is very important here because the target is not only manufacturing companies. Salim Group already engaged with over 60 businesses, including development, power plant, natural resources, a convenience store, or local supermarket, electricity, and media, and so on. Therefore, this project of large M&A is very strategic in order to generate national level of industry or industrial complexes is a target and eventual plan of this kind of strategy. Therefore, the likely scenario is that the Indonesia will buy out power plant company, for example, and we will cooperate with Salim Group in order to incorporate newly acquired power plant company into their existing local business, such as nuclear power plant or electricity power plant or thermal power plant. And Salim Group in Indonesia is already successful by trading and exporting those technologies and products to other trading companies in Japan, such as Mitsui Group and Mitsubishi Group and so on. And that's the likely outcome. And therefore, it's very unlikely that we will overly dependent on one single company. Therefore, their stock price will fundamentally damage the balance sheet. Moreover, secondly, before we buy and acquire share, we usually hire financial advisory such as Citibank, JP Morgan, Nomura Security, and Goldman Sachs. And we have ability, and these corporations, institutions have ability to check balance sheet, profit loss and cash flow statement, and so on. And moreover, Deputy Leader of Opposition conceded that there's a political pressure. Therefore, there is a political pressure from the citizens of Tota to compel the government to be accountable on the due diligence process as much as possible. Therefore, it is very less likely that risky investment will rampantly occur and that the government will buy out some random company which have no relation with the pre-existing local industry. Of course, in a contractual level, we check key man conditions such as the key person in the company will not be like fired or assigned. We will call it lockup. Like a lockup will be usually 3 years to 5 years. We also proactively secure the salary and bonus and economic conditions for key players within corporations. So therefore, the kind of risk that they're worried about is very less likely to happen. But even if we accept all the risk and financial loss explained by opposition bench, why benefit overrides those small risks? 2 reasons. First of all, in a long term, we think this is a long-term national industrial project. Even though the stock price goes down temporarily, we don't care, because what we need is a fundamental technologies or patent or IP that these corporations have. That's what we'd like to leverage by cooperating with existing companies. Therefore, we don't care about short-term stock price. Secondly, the most valuable countries right now are underinvested in the status quo, such as Cambodia within ASEAN country. The Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia is very strong. But what about Cambodia and Vietnam? We are able to reach out these smaller and underinvested countries by creating the scheme or structure in which local conglomerates and newly acquired company are able to generate mutual profit. And that's the goal. I'd like to take a point from open opposition if you want to.
So the problem with the case is that it sounds not like buying stocks in the open market, but asking local giants to create joint ventures or buying stocks instead of the governments. So what does precisely cooperation with local giants mean? Is it joint ventures or whatever?
No. The motion is about like acquire. That means we will take over 50% of the share. Like we don't have a total control of whatever corporation policies are, but we have large degree of influence over the decision-making process of companies, such as dispatching the board members, and we have ability to veto in the conference meeting, as my partner explained in his speech. Therefore, we are trying to target various kinds of public companies, not limited to one manufacturer automobile industry, and that's realistic context. Finally, why we are better than OG? Because OG's case is at best mitigation of exploitation, right? But I think open opposition explained that there are many other alternative mechanisms to address the issue of exploitation. More than that, secondly, the OG case is dependent upon the incentive of government to be charitable. We don't rely on that. We have a capacity and ability to expedite the process of industrialization by cooperating with local conglomerates and Tata groups in India and Salim Group in Indonesia. That likely outcome is more realistic. We are happy to propose. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Government Whip, for that speech. To close this debate, let's invite Opposition Whip.
Yeah, 聞こえますか？
はい、聞こえてます。
ありがとうございます。I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. OG tells us that if developing countries acquire stakes in multinational companies, that means that they get rid of their exploitative behaviors. And Seiji tells us that if developing countries can first use developed technologies and second collectivize their incentive, then they get the benefit that we all want in the end. We tell you that these are all speculative measures and speculative benefits that like side government tells you, and we don't think it will manifest in the exact way that they tell you today. I want to talk about how this manifests in the worst way, right? 2 things. First, developed countries will then opt out of the multinational companies. Why will this happen? Why is this bad? This is because developing countries have the incentive to cater towards themselves, right? They want to have a say in where these factories are built and how much profit that they want from these multinational companies. Therefore, this means that they will opt out in the end. In the current scenario, multinational companies have the biggest stakes and financial capabilities, which means that by reducing labor to the cheapest and by making the biggest profit to themselves, this is how they gain the benefit from holding the stakes of these companies. Therefore, this is why many developed countries put factories in developing countries, which are more likely to have cheaper labor and have the financial need to agree to this transaction, right? So we think that ultimately developed countries have this incentive when it comes to controlling multinational companies, and developing countries would want to be able to have a political say in these multinational companies. So in short, the loss of profit through change of policies are going to de-incentivize them into continue to like kind of invest in these companies, and we think that in the end they will pull out. They're not going to negotiate with developing countries because ultimately the reason why they use you in the first place is because they're willing to be exploited, right? We don't think that at the end of the day they will still agree to this entire transaction, the moment in which their profit gets reduced and they don't have a say, we think that then they will pull out. Why is this bad, right? What is going to happen is that your stakes value will diminish. You immediately lose out on the prices of the stakes that you just acquired, and this is going to take a while to come back. Developed countries acquire big stakes. The moment to which you shift the corporation's focus to your own interest, we think that you lose out on their financial benefit. Now you're left with bad stakes, even less than before. Though CG said that it is not important, that like in the end what they want is patent and what they want is technologies, we think that the biggest thing that should be prioritized in this debate is the stakes and is the kind of short-term value that will be able to go back to these developing countries. I think that not all developing countries have the magical undiscovered natural resources that they tell you about, right? A lot of countries still rely on pure manufacturing, right? And we think that the moment in which the developing countries are able to have the kind of connection to the multinational companies, we think that to somewhat extent the patents and the technologies will be able to acquire somehow. If you're not able to get this short-term return back though, your investments, it will just mean that you need more fundings, right? You need more fundings in the end for you to keep like sustaining this multinational companies, which means that by the loss of stakes and by the diminishing value of your stake, that means that you need more money to go into these like multinational companies. What do we think will happen by this? Two things. A, you need more funding in the end. As the process of the stakes happens, you need more to cover up. You need more funding circulating, which means that in the end we come to a situation where the government is reliant on their own financial development with a multinational corporation than their own development that it's going to happen on our side. But B, pre-established bases of these developed nations will draw out, right? As I told you earlier, how the developed nations will draw out. The factories that you previously had now have to be entirely operated by yourself. You just do not get the amount of profit that you suspected. In the end, in that case, we think you lose out on more and you have less likelihood of succeeding in the end and to be able to potentially get this financial gain back, right? In this specific case, by the developed countries pulling out, we think that the benefit of CG tells you about like technologies and about securing future development also becomes a loss, right? Because at the end of the day, you just don't have enough to like sustain this. You don't have enough to circulate this. You just put in more money. And this is where our case manifests, where we tell you that over-reliance is going to be a big thing. And we think that ultimately this is not going to be good. But it also takes money to bring in these technologies, right? To build these technologies. It takes money for the entire process to happen. This takes a prospective market and a premise on the fact that these MNCs will succeed, to which we tell you is not as easy as the government bench makes it sound with developing countries' likelihood to pull out. But second thing I want to talk about is that you still do not structurally solve the ongoing issue in developing countries, right? I'm going to talk about two things. A, developing countries do not have the incentive to care for other developing countries. Yeah, sure, like what CG tells you, certain countries will have collective incentive to benefit their own alliances. But we think that what is going to continue to exist in these countries' incentives is try to suppress the raw cost of production anyways. So you simply create a world where you just want to move this exploitation to another country, right? But even with that, I want to talk about why collective interest does not play the biggest role in this debate. Because even if you have the collective interest to try to create more opportunities, campaigning still happens, right? Natural resources still exist in restricted developing countries. So they're still going to fight for the potential investments. Therefore, the lowering of prices will become more intense because we know that developing countries have more incentive for opt for low project cost. But B, exploitation of countries continue in your own country, right? Because lowering production cost prices and wanting to continue the high profits is going to cause this. We already told you how wealth segregation will become more drastic. And we think that this is more likely to happen because in developing countries where there is already a wealth gap between people, because the economic has not fully established itself yet, and people who are able to land themselves the opportunity will have gotten the wealth, but now it continues this way. But as you're able to control policies, we think that the countries does have the incentive to want to gain more profit as a nation than to try to trickle down the benefit. Much of these developing countries are not democracies, right? Politicians would likely gain more support if they're able to raise the wages of certain bases of people and to secure their votes, even if we were to say that they are in a democratic country, because we think that ultimately the political incentive and campaign have lower standards in developing countries where generally people do not have much choices in their political vocalization, right? So therefore it means that they only have to like raise the overall benefit of the country rather than to trickle it down, and we think that that is ultimately going to lead to a bad outcome. So through comparison, Why do we think short-term exploitation is better than like no development, right? So that basically refutes like the entire OG case, why we think like exploitation will not necessarily like be solved magically, but also why do we think that even like through weighing it is going to be less prioritized? Because we think the short-term exploitation by MNCs is inevitable to somewhat extent if you are to introduce them and you are like a developing country. But as you increase your risk and dependency on a certain MNCs, then you risk the higher exploitation happening. Then that is going to be damages to your own nation that takes away from the infrastructure funds, from the money that you have gotten from your own establishments. This is what O wasn't able to prove to you, because they tell you by boycotting power reduces exploitation to happen. We don't necessarily think that is true to the full extent, so we give you this analysis that exploitation is not going to be solved, but even further, you're further exploited by your own people and your country lose out on more money. This is what CO tells you today. I'm proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you for that speech, and thank you all speakers for a wonderful round. We will proceed with the deliberation, so you could give us time. Thank you.